That brings us to an end of the papers to be delivered during this panel, but that means we can now move on to any questions people may have for the presenters. Can I just ask that people either type their questions into the chat and then I can read them out to the appropriate presenter, or if you're able to use the hands up function where you put your hands up, I'll then call on you and ask you, if that's all right. So if anybody does have a question off the bat, then I'll be more than happy to guide them to the presenters. Michael, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, there's a delay in raising the hand, and I think, oh, I didn't raise it, so I lowered it as soon as raising it. But there we go. What a great set of papers that was. I enjoyed them all, but I wanted to talk to Tauheeda about podcasting, and it's I'm wondering about you sort of mentioned towards the end about the gentleness with which you allowed the students to sort of feel the freedom to take part in the activity, that it wasn't for public consumption. So do you see podcasting in pedagogical terms as skill development, as a different way of transmitting ideas? And then again, you mentioned a bit about how the students on the modules are not always in the disciplinary home that you're teaching them in. So is this about, creative ways of transmitting materials, or are you building in them something that they can then take and present out to a wider world, knowing how much podcasts have become a method of people consuming information now, not just in the COVID times where we're getting very familiar with online technologies, but just as we saw that rise of podcasting prior to the pandemic. So if you just talk about the aims of the tool for your students.
So thank you for that question. So the podcast is actually public. It's not something that I widely, send out to the entire community, but certainly within our school community. So they're aware that students in other classes or throughout the institution will hear it. And so with that aim, students as their peers and that sort of thing, I think once that audience is in mind, that students do make a concerted effort to make sure that the quality is somewhat good, but they're not professional podcasters, so I don't expect that when I grade the actual podcast. But to your point about podcasting and its sort of rise and its usefulness as a tool, not just within the classroom, but sort of wider discourse and discussion around a wide variety of topics, I think yes, it can definitely be something that grows in the sense of not just being that pedagogical tool, but also a community, building tool. So I don't know if that answers your full question, but.
Yeah, I guess maybe, and it's I didn't get, how long is have you been running this class and doing this exercise with them?
So this will be my second year doing it, and the first semester that I did it, we actually, had access to all of the materials, all the tools on campus. So the great microphones, the sound, the sound rooms, the soundproofed rooms, and all that stuff. But once we moved into the Zoom environment, they just kind of had to make do with what they had, and that proved challenging. But from the last 2 years, I've learned that it's not necessarily the technology that can produce, really good results. It's the dynamics of the process, the group, and how they structure their overall topic. So.
Thank you. I guess it'll be interesting to see how they carry on with that in years to come. If this experience of doing that in the class becomes something that they choose to adopt when they're far from the classroom. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you for that.
Great. Thanks both. Gary, you currently have your hand up. Is this a question or to answer something?
No, it's just a quick question. Tauheeda, again, I was just wondering what the specific issue, whether you could provide more details on what the specific issues were in putting the podcasts out into the public domain, somewhere like Spotify or one of these channels, and how that was. Were there any particular issues about negotiating that with the students? And what was the public reaction?
Yeah, definitely. So I it's currently on Spotify. It's on, I think it's Google Podcasts. So with each, so there are release forms that need to be signed for any of the interviewees. And so once they turn in the podcast and it's consumed, internally, I have to make sure that I have all of the legal stuff underway before I can really disseminate it. And some students are better at that than others. So not all of the podcasts I'm able to actually publish because I don't have release forms for some of the interviews that the students were supposed to get. But some students were, fine with being out there in the public sphere. Others were more reluctant, or they only wanted to use their first name or, a pseudonym or something like that. So it is definitely something that I've had to negotiate, not with all students. Most of the students are pretty, okay with having something like this out there. But others, it depends on also the age group. I have quite a few seniors who've taken the course, and, there's differences in terms of people's sort of understanding about the podcasting world overall and how far it could actually travel. So I think, there's definitely some age differences with how it's carried. I don't know if that answers it.
Thank you. Thanks both. Arslan Ahmed, you have a hand up as well.
Hello, can you hear me right now?
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I have a very brief question from Safia Shahid. She was narrating about the prophetic traditions and all this stuff. So while investigating all this stuff, how she underlooked upon a very famous hadith, Dua fil Islam, because I'm working on COVID-19 and theology in Pakistan these days. And there are two very prominent Sunni scholars who are contesting on the same hadith, that there is no contingent in Islam. However, the other person who is also a PhD and a professor, he is arguing absolutely against this narration. So how Safia look into such kind of ambiguous hadiths, which instead of going for creating a single universal response from the Muslims and divide them more?
Unfortunately, I don't. Safia is unable to join us today. That's why it was recorded. If you would like, if you can send me an email, Arslan, I will then forward it on to Safia herself to answer that question. Is that okay?
Sure. If I have your email, why not?
Of course. It's. I'll put it in the chat if that's okay. Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat. Rob, you have a question as well, I can see.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wow. It's really always a miracle when I manage to get digital technology to work, although I'm interested in it and even teach about it. I guess this is a question for Gary and Tauheeda, but it's an issue that I think all of us that work in digital media think about. But when we're talking about authority, my question is around authorship of digital texts or posts or productions. I mean, Muhammadiyah is a vast, sprawling, massive organization, and yet it posts messages and videos that are read as authentic. Sistani is an individual, but represents a tradition and a vast institutional architecture. I doubt Sistani is personally responding on his cell phone to every fatwa that comes his way. So how transparent is the production process? With Muhammadiyah and Sistani, for example, are they open about the teams of digital moderators and curators that are producing this? Or are people led to believe that they're getting a personal message from Sistani, for example? So, and then at a broader level, and this is for Tauheeda, how do we deal with this question of authorship and digital materials in the classroom? I mean, all of us have students, and the typical response is, well, I found it on the internet. And I've just found it challenging to get students to poke and probe and go further to try to determine the biography and the authority of posts that are coming, and not just simply taking them as default authentic. So a vague question, but authorship and authority, both in the classroom and for scholars.
Thank you, Rob.
Gary, I'll let you go first.
You're too kind. Okay, so yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose it depends on the specific context, because there are some organizations and platforms that are really transparent in terms of the type of outputs that they are putting in place, but then there are others where they just have, like with Sistani, I think it's more of the idea that everything is endorsed. So I don't think anything ever goes out without an official gatekeeper approval. Otherwise, that could be really problematic. But obviously, everything is in a sort of safe pair of hands, I suppose. So they would have people, they're not going to have anybody sort of going off message in terms of either of these platforms and organizations. I don't think there's any specific illusion that it's coming from the top in relation to Muhammadiyah. But what is interesting is that many of the senior people, I'm not an Indonesia expert or anything like that, but from my initial impressions, what's interesting is that a number of the senior individuals will take the time to put up, or at least be very much central to their own posts, or they'll be central to their videos, or they'll have a central statement which is produced and presented onto their website. So in terms of that level of endorsement, then I think that it's certainly embedded there. And I think what is also interesting, sorry, long answer, but what is also interesting is as we get more people who are, quote, digital natives, unquote, and are digitally literate, that sort of barrier between the opinion and the person putting it out might be substantially reduced, because we are seeing now more people who classify themselves as scholars who are directly putting their outputs online without going through any gatekeeper or intermediary. And they might even be doing it on their cell phone. So, I mean, it's a big question, but an interesting one. But I like the idea of some of the senior clerics actually using their mobile phones and whatever. It might be like me struggling with Teams sometimes today. But anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Gary. Tauheeda, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's something that I've struggled with in terms of thinking through how to give students the tools to actually be able to work through some of these questions. I bring in the librarians quite a bit because I think that being able to identify sources for authenticity or bias and that sort of thing is a skill that I think I need help with in terms of, because I just have so many students, it often gets really difficult, in a 35-person class to look at every single group's resources. And so, I have the librarian come in and do a whole spiel about, how do we identify a website? How do we make sure, that it's an academic source? How do we, determine the overall, the overall, aims and goals of a site and that sort of thing. And so that I find that that's been helpful for students to work through. And okay, thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, I hope that answers at least somewhat of, tools that you could use in helping with that.
Thank you. Thank you to the questioner and the two for providing answers there as well. Arslan and Rob, you still have your hands up. I'm presuming they're kind of legacy hands. If anyone else has a question.
Yeah, mine's a legacy hand, sorry.
It's all right. Do feel free to pop them either in the chat or to put your hand up. I don't see any currently, but I had a question for Gary, if that's all right. So I might just take the opportunity to drop it in here. Gary, I found your paper really interesting. I wanted to ask about where you see kind of new locations of authority appearing or kind of challenging kind of more established patterns of authority, because I think what we've seen with a lot of COVID is this kind of dynamic of new sources of authority, right, developing on the internet to challenge kind of established forms of authority. So I wonder whether you could just speak to that for in some way.
Sure.
Gary?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah. It's very interesting because I think this is something that we've seen, well, throughout the study of this so-called cyber Islamic environment since I started. There have always been these new locations appearing, and they often appear in response to new media forms emerging. So people sort of getting on to new forms of social media and finding that as a really good adjunct to their ideas and projections of authority. So we're always seeing that as part of the process. And maybe there's been a spike, if that's the right term, post-COVID, because we're seeing a lot of new materials and sources, or people putting more effort into some of their materials as well. And I was just thinking off the top of my head about what would be a good example. And I think some of the chat show type formats that we've seen that have been, they were going pre-COVID, but they seem to have picked up a lot more in terms of ideas. One good example of that is the Scottish channel Deanspiration, that has got a really neat chat show format where they cover a lot of ground in terms of different ideas about responding to contemporary situations. But what's interesting about it is that they're very user-friendly. They're not kind of austere. They're not just presenting a lecture. So they're making good use of the media in a way that perhaps some of the earlier generations were simply putting what they've got on paper and putting it onto a website. Now we've got people who are far more digitally literate. I mean, Deanspiration isn't the only one. I mean, there are several other channels. For example, I've been doing quite a lot of work on Shiism in the last several months, and there are a number of YouTube chat channels, again, which have got a more relaxed attitude towards the way that they're presenting. I think that's indicative of the fact that they're competing for attention with other zones. There's a lot out there on the internet, good stuff, bad stuff, points in between. They've got to try and attract the necessary attention. So having a more, if I like, hip approach where it's similar to something that you might see on a broadcaster, I think that's the way in which a lot of these influences are going to enhance their profiles. We're starting to see some of the bigger organizations now also adopting those sorts of formats as well. So it's more sort of broadcast format. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's super, really interesting. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
Can I ask if anybody else has a question? Do feel free to put your hand up or post it in the chat. Otherwise, Rob, I'm assuming that's still a previous hand. But if not,
it is. Then to remove it would require me to understand how to do that. But yeah, okay. No, I'm good.
That's quite all right. Otherwise, I think we have covered all of the questions that that people had. So I'd once again just like to thank our speakers for their papers, both recorded and live as well. Thank you for taking your time, and thank you for sharing some of your insights with us today. Thank you to the audience for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and join us and listen to our speakers, and for the questions that we've had after the session as well.